Welcome to the YouTube channel of the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf, where we embark on a deep exploration of meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. Your continued support means the world to us, and we kindly ask you to like and share this audiobook to broaden its reach, bringing the wisdom it holds to even more people. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to receive immediate notifications when new content is uploaded. Together, we can foster a community dedicated to enlightenment and inner tranquility by spreading the teachings of meditation and mindfulness. We are sincerely grateful for your involvement in our mission to make these transformative teachings universally accessible. For your convenience, we've included a video playlist in the description below. Let's now begin today's reading. Mindfulness of Death. June 18, 2021. Of the 4 guardian meditations, 2 are special. Contemplation of the foulness of the body and mindfulness of death, the Buddha said, can both lead to the deathless. He doesn't say that about recollection of the Buddha, doesn't say that about the development of goodwill, but if you follow the contemplation of the body and mindfulness of death in the proper way, they can take you beyond the body and beyond death. How mindfulness of death does this can be seen in those 5 recollections that we chant so often. The last 3 are especially relevant here. First, you simply remind yourself of the fact of death. It could come at any time. You haven't gone beyond it. You can see other people dying, and it's so easy to forget. They die, well, we're going to die, too. We're remarkably blind in that way. We're like the penguins in the story Charcot told of his sailors down in Antarctica. They were staying next to a penguin colony, and the sailors found that they could kill a penguin right in the middle of the colony, take it back, and make penguin pâté, as long as they were quiet about it. The other penguins didn't notice. The men could walk through the colony, and the penguins felt no fear, even though their numbers were going down one by one by one. That's the way it is with a lot of us. So the Buddha has you reflect. You haven't gone beyond death. It can come at any time. There's a famous passage where he's talking to some monks and saying, cultivate mindfulness of death. Different monks say, well, I already do that. The Buddha asks them how often they do it. One monk says he does it once a day. Another monk says twice a day. The monks get down to shorter and shorter intervals, until finally one monk says, in the amount of time that it takes to chew a morsel of food, I tell myself I could die, but I can do a lot in the meantime. Another monk says, in the amount of time it takes to breathe in and breathe out, I tell myself I have enough time in this one breath to do a lot of good in the practice. The Buddha says, of the various monks, only those last 2 are really heedful. The rest are heedless. In other words, you have to be right on top of the present moment, realizing that you have no time to waste. There's work to be done here. What kind of work to be done is something that comes not only with reflecting on the fact of death, but also the Buddha's analysis of what happens at death. That falls in with the next 2 reflections. You're going to be separated from all that is dear and appealing to you. Often our first reaction to the thought of death is, if I die, I'll be missing this person, that person. If the reflection were to stop there, you'd be left without any real guidance. You'd simply start getting sentimental, very attached, very clingy. But then the Buddha goes on to have you reflect about karma. That you're the owner of your actions, the other person is the owner of his or her actions. How you die, and where you're going to go after you die, is going to depend a great deal on your actions both present and past. It's not going to depend on any other person at all. This is where the Buddha gives specific guidance, saying that at the moment of death, the mind will latch on to craving and be swept from one body to another, in the same way that a fire can latch on to the wind and be swept from one burning house to a house next door, setting that second house on fire. The problem with wind is that it's blind. Craving tends to be blind, too, so you want to make sure that your karma is not blind. At the moment of death, you're going to be offered choices. Which houses happen to be next door will depend on what you've been doing throughout your life. If you've been doing good things, there will be good houses. Things not so good, there'll be houses you might not want to go to, but that's where the wind will blow you. So as the Buddha said, there are 4 qualities you want to develop to help ensure that you'll at least have a good house to be blown to. There's conviction in the Buddha's awakening. Virtue, making sure that you follow the precepts. Generosity, you're generous with your wealth, with your time. As the Buddha said in another reference to a burning house, when a house is about to burn down, you don't leave valuables in the house. You get them out of the house, and the ones you get out are the ones that you'll be able to save. In the same way, the things you've given away are saved. The things you hold on to are the ones that you'll have to leave behind in the burning house. Finally, there's discernment, seeing what's skillful in the mind, what's unskillful in the mind, and knowing how to talk yourself into doing what's skillful and out of doing what's unskillful, regardless of your likes or dislikes. When you reflect on the fact of your own death, remind yourself, these are the qualities I've got to develop in myself. When you reflect on the fact that the people you love are going to die, your best gift to them before you part would be to encourage them to develop these qualities as well. In this way, you're a true good friend to them, because after all, these 4 qualities are the attributes of a Kalyanamitta, an admirable friend. We tend to think of a Kalyanamitta as being a friend in the Dhamma, but being a Kalyanamitta can also mean simply that you're a friend to other members of your family, those who are close to you. If you really love them, you remind yourself that they're agents, too. They're subject to their karma. Then you want to do your best to make sure, to whatever extent you can influence them, that they're established in these qualities as well. There are also other qualities that the Buddha recommends developing in preparation for death. There's a list of the qualities of devas. It's basically those 4 qualities: conviction, virtue, generosity, discernment plus learning. This, of course, refers to the Dhamma you've learned, and most particularly, I think, the Dhamma you've memorized. This is why it's good to memorize passages in Pali and English, so that you have some skillful thoughts sloshing around in the mind. After all, as death comes, the mind can latch on to all kinds of things, and if you've been impregnating your mind with good Dhamma, then that can have an influence on you at times like that. That's some of the past karma you'll be bringing with you. As for the beings that go to the level of the Brahmas, they develop the Brahmaviharas. This is another good way of preparing for death. At the same time, you want to develop the qualities that you need right at the moment of the death, the present karma that you'll be engaged in at that time. There's a sutta where the Buddha comes to a sick ward and tells the monks to approach death mindful and alert. These are the 2 main qualities you're going to need at that time, and of course they're the qualities you develop as you meditate. The Buddha then gives the standard definition for establishing mindfulness: keeping focused on the body in and of itself, ardent, alert, and mindful, putting aside greed and distress with reference to the world. The same with feelings in and of themselves, mind states in and of themselves, dhammas in and of themselves. As for alertness, you're alert to the postures of the body, the movements of the body as they're happening, so you're focused on what you're doing, and you want to make sure that craving doesn't sweep in and distract you at that point. This is where the other guardian meditations are helpful. When you're feeling abandoned, alone, facing the fact that you could be dying, you recollect the Buddha and all the noble ones who have been practicing. You're following in their footsteps. They were able to approach the moment of death as victors and, in many cases, alone. One of the purposes of the recollection of the Buddha and Sangha is that if they can do it, you can, too. When memories come up of people who have wronged you or people whom you've wronged, develop thoughts of goodwill. When you start getting attached to the body, it's good to recollect that the body is made out of what? It's made out of those 32 parts, plus other parts, none of which is endowed with any special inherent goodness. The goodness of the body is what you did with it. Now that it's a tool no longer functioning, it's time to put the tool aside. It's not good for anything anymore, except as an object of contemplation. If you can maintain your focus, then the Buddha has you focus particularly on the issue of feelings in the body, because those are the things that'll stand out most at that point. If there's a feeling of pain, he has you reflect on the fact that this feeling of pain is dependent on what? It's dependent on the body. Is the body constant? No, it's inconstant. If the condition is inconstant, how can the pain be constant? There's another passage that says pain is like the shadow of a stump. The stump is inconstant. It's not going to last forever, so how can its shadow last forever? So look at pains as shadows. And as the Buddha said, when you reflect on this, from inconstant you go to stressful, from stressful you go to not self. That's how you engage in the last 4 steps of breath meditation at that point. Focused on inconstancy, focused on dispassion, cessation, and then letting go. So whatever pains come up, approach them this way, not with the thought that this is my pain or I am in pain, but simply seeing that the body is one thing, the pain is something else. The body as a cause is inconstant, so the pain's got to be inconstant, too. Look for its inconstancy. That helps to pull you out. Then the Buddha has you go on and do the same thing with feelings of pleasure and feelings of equanimity. In other words, if you're able to get the mind into deep concentration at that point, you realize that these states, too, are dependent on the body. The pleasure of jhana, the equanimity of jhana. They, too, are things you have to let go. If you can do this, the Buddha says, then you can be free of any aversion obsession with regard to pain, any passion obsession with regard to pleasure, and any ignorance obsession with regard to equanimity. You sense these things disjoined from them, realizing that as the body ends, they're going to end too, and what remains is the deathless. That's how mindfulness of death prepares you to find the deathless. It depends on remembering that we're not simply aware of the fact that death is going to happen, but we also have a particular take on how it's going to happen. The Buddha's instructions on how to anticipate what's going to happen. The mind will be swept along by its cravings depending on its karma, the karma you do as you go through the day, and the karma you're doing as you approach the moment of death. Your daily habits, your meditative skills, these are the things that will determine whether you suffer or not. This way, you're prepared emotionally, but you're also prepared in terms of the skills you'll have to bring to bear. When you approach mindfulness of death from this perspective, then you're going to get the most out of it. So as the Buddha says, when you see the sunset, remind yourself that this could be your last sunset. You could go tonight. Are you ready to go? Look at what needs to be done, both in terms of preparing yourself, and in terms of leaving a good gift behind for the people you have to leave. Remember those 4 qualities: conviction, virtue, generosity, discernment. To whatever extent you can develop them, to whatever extent you can help others develop them, that's your gift. But your true gift to yourself, though, comes in the form of the skills you develop as you meditate, learning how not to get distracted, how to stay mindful, alert, and in particular, alert not only to the postures of the body, but also to what you're doing in the mind. How you're relating to your feelings and to your sense of the body. The work that needs to be done is not far away. It's all right here, which is good because there will come a time when death will be right here, and you'll have your skills right here, too. You'll be prepared. Body Contemplation. June 9, 2021. The passage we chanted just now talks about having goodwill for beings that are born and those seeking birth. The Buddha was a good example of someone who had goodwill for both kinds of beings. Think about the way he taught body contemplation. It's good for you while you're alive, and it's good to keep in mind when you die. It's a good practice to have done when the mind is trying to figure out where to go. While you're alive, it's good for dealing with lust or with any sense of pride around your body. In the forest tradition, they teach 2 kinds of body contemplation. One is taking the body apart into its component parts, visualizing the different parts one by one, although they also recommend remembering that the body, as you take it apart like this, is not made out of neat organs like you see in an anatomical diagram. Everything is all covered with blood, even the bones. It's good to think about the fact that here is this human body which the Buddha said is the most captivating sensual object in the world. If you're looking for happiness in the human plane, this is the central place, yet what is it made out of? Its beauty goes only as deep as the skin. And even the skin itself, if you were to take it off, would be nothing to look at, just a slimy pile. Yet people are so infatuated with this. The Buddha taught body contemplation as a way of getting out of that infatuation, protecting yourself not only from your own defilements, but from other people. We can do a lot of stupid, foolish, and harmful things based on the defilements that come out of those beliefs. At the same time, if you're attached to how you look, there's always the question, do you still look good? That question makes you an easy mark for other people. You want to look good in their eyes, and they'll be happy to tell you what you want to hear because they have designs on you. Think of the case of the nun going through the forest. A libertine comes up and talks to her about how lovely she is. He invites her to leave her life as a nun. She says, "What is there in this body that you can even look at?" "Your eyes," he says. "Your eyes." He goes on and on and on about her eyes. Fortunately, she'd contemplated her body so that she wasn't infatuated with her eyes or with any part of it at all, which meant that she was immune to his designs. She finally says, "Well, if you like my eyes, here, have one." She plucks one out and offers it to him. Of course that scares him. A woman that bold, a woman that brave. He backs off. The fact that she had done this contemplation was what saved her. The story ends with her going to see the Buddha. Just looking at him, the eye that she had plucked out grew back. Symbolic, of course, of the fact that her inner eyes were very clear. And because she was clear about the nature of the body, that's what saved her. The other contemplation that's popular in the forest tradition is imagining your body as it ages and then decomposes at death. Ajahn Fuang would often have students who, as they were meditating, would get a vision of themselves sitting in front of themselves. He'd say, "Okay, imagine that body in 1 year from now, 2 years, 3, 4, 5, 10, 20, 30. Watch it decay. And then when it dies, 1 day after it's dead, 2 days, 3, 4, 5, as it swells up, gets livid, breaks open, and then dries up to the point where there's nothing left but bones." He would then have them burn the bones so that there would be nothing but dust and ashes. Then he'd have them go from the dust back through the bones, reversing the various stages of decomposition back to the body as it is in the present moment, to remind them that this is the fate of this body they were sitting in right there. That's what it's going to become. Again, that's to get rid of any sense of attachment around it. This is how the teaching helps when you're passing away as well. Ajahn Fuang noted this when he was teaching meditation in Bangkok. He taught at a funeral monastery and sometimes on a Saturday evening, when there were very few people coming to see him on Saturdays, most people would come in the middle of the day. He'd walk around the monastery a bit to stretch his legs. One day he came back and said, "You know, the number of people who die and don't leave their bodies is really large." You wonder what he saw? You can imagine people identifying themselves with their bodies, then being pushed out, but not imagining anything else, and not knowing where to go. What would it be like to hang around a body as it decomposes? The purpose of this is to realize that once you've left this body, you don't want to hang around. There's nothing of any value here. It also reminds you if you go to any other body, the same thing is going to happen. The same 32 parts of the body and then death again, decay, death, more decay. When will we have had enough? If you come back to the human realm, this is it. This is the most riveting sensual object in the human realm, the one that excites the most fantasizing. But when you look at it objectively, this is all you get. The parts that you like are right next to parts that are disgusting. You can't have one without the other, so why take either? The purpose of this contemplation is to lift your sights, to realize that there must be a better way to find happiness. Think of the Buddha's graduated or step-by-step discourse, talking about the virtue of generosity, the virtue of observing the precepts, the rewards of generosity and virtue in terms of sensual pleasures in the human realm and heavenly realms. But then the drawbacks of sensuality. The text even calls it the degradation of sensuality. Think of all the degrading things you do for sensual pleasures, but then even if you get the best sensual pleasures, you're going to have to lose them. When you lose them, you fall down again, and you have to start being good again. It just goes around and around and around and it goes nowhere. What's the allure? your perceptions of beauty around the body. The body is not the problem. The problem is with your perceptions. You want to perceive the body as beautiful to feed your fantasies, and this is the way we deal with sensual pleasures of all kinds. The real pleasure is in the fantasizing. The embroidery, the fabrication around the actual feeling of pleasure are thoughts of the kind of sensual pleasures we'd like, and the sensual pleasures we've had. The free play of our imagination is what keeps pulling us back because, in that free play, you're free to lie to yourself, and the mind likes to lie to itself. After all, what are the actual objects of sensual pleasure? They all have their drawbacks, but in the mental image you create around them you can erase the drawbacks. You can have all the fun you want, but then when you try to live out your fantasies, they keep pulling you back to these same old things, the same old disappointments. Here again we see the Buddha's compassion, his goodwill for us in setting these teachings out, so that we begin to see how the mind has been lying to itself. You can ask yourself, how much longer do you want to be taken in by your own lies? Ajahn Mahabua talked about doing body contemplation to the point where he'd just look at a human body and immediately take it apart. In fact, it got so in his imagination that it would fall apart on its own. He began to wonder, was he done with sensual desire? There had been no moment of insight, though, that had told him, okay, this is the point where it's done. So he started imagining a beautiful body to test his mind. It took several days, but finally, on the third or fourth day, there was just a little bit of a stirring of liking for that body. So he realized that his sensual desire was not gone. What to do now? He came to see that the issue was with the perception of attractive and the perception of unattractive, and the desires behind those perceptions. The fact that we want to lie to ourselves. Look into that desire, right there, because that's the key to why we keep on suffering. We cling to the things that make us suffer, and this is why we like to lie to ourselves. So that we can keep on clinging, thinking that's the only way to find happiness. So look at that, try to figure that one out, and you will have gone far in unlocking a lot of the secrets of the mind, the secrets of its ignorance and its craving. That's what the Buddha tells us, out of his compassion. He's giving us this meditation as a protection. It's listed as one of the guardian meditations. So it's up to us to actually do the meditation, to get that protection, even though it's listed as a painful meditation topic. As he said, contemplation of the body leads to the deathless. Look into it to see how that's so. Goodwill is a guardian. June 7, 2021. The Buddha teaches 3 governing principles, 3 ways of thinking to keep yourself on the path, and 2 of them have to do with goodwill, or metta. The first one involves your goodwill for yourself. You remind yourself that you entered on this path because you wanted to put an end to your suffering. Basically, you loved yourself. But now what? If you're planning to leave the path, does it mean you no longer want to put an end to the suffering? What happened to your goodwill for yourself? That's one way of thinking that involves goodwill. The other way has to do with other people's goodwill for you. The Buddha calls it taking the world as a governing principle. You remind yourself that there are beings in the world who can read your mind. Suppose the Buddha were reading your mind and he saw that you were planning to give up on the path. What would he think? He'd be concerned. If you're thinking this way, you should feel embarrassed, because here's someone else who has goodwill for you, who wants to see you put an end to suffering, and you're going to let someone else have more goodwill for you than you have for yourself? Thinking in these ways shows how goodwill is one of the guardian meditations. It's one of the ways of keeping yourself on the path. You start out, may I be happy, may I be free from stress and pain. Well, where are you going to find happiness? It's not going to come floating by. It's going to come because you've done something that's conducive to happiness. Think about the Buddha's ways of expressing what it means to extend goodwill to yourself and goodwill to others. It's not simply, may you be happy, happy, happy. He also includes thoughts along the lines of, may you not behave in an unskillful way. In one of the suttas where the Buddha expresses that, he says, may no one despise anyone, or wish ill to anyone anywhere. In other words, not only may these people be happy, But may they also not engage in unskillful behavior, which would then lead to results of unskillful behavior. Pain and suffering. May they develop thoughts of universal goodwill, too. Which means when you think of goodwill for yourself, it should include not only, may I be happy, but also, may I understand the causes for happiness, and be willing and able to act on them. Then you spread the same thought to others, hoping that they will behave in a skillful way, too. You place no limits on your goodwill. Ask yourself, is there anybody out there for whom it's hard to feel goodwill of this sort? Some people will probably come to mind. But then you have to ask yourself further. What do I gain from their suffering? What would the world gain from their suffering? You might say, well, maybe they'll come to their senses. But a lot of people, when they suffer, don't come to their senses at all. They just get more and more entrenched in their old ways. The world would be a much better place if people could understand how to find genuine happiness and then act on their understanding. If there's any way you can help them toward that understanding, you'll be happy to help. Thinking like this protects you in lots of ways, guards you in lots of ways, in that it helps to keep you on the path. After all, remind yourself, if you really want to be happy, this is what you've got to do. Goodwill is a universal good human quality, but it becomes specifically Buddhist when you start thinking about what the Buddha had to say about what leads to happiness. You think about his goodwill in teaching us to begin with. He taught what? How to put an end to suffering. That was motivated by goodwill. It's the best way to find happiness. The Buddha's greatest gift, when people came to see him, would be to teach them. He'd start with a graduated discourse, talking about the virtues of giving, the virtues of observing the precepts, the sensual rewards of giving, the sensual rewards of the precepts, but then the drawback of sensuality. In other words, the rewards would be either happiness in the human realm or in the higher realms. But even those higher realms have their drawbacks, because the kind of pleasure that comes in this way is not going to last forever. If you get used to having nothing but good things happening to you as a result of your past good karma, it begins to spoil you. Then you get complacent and you start misbehaving, you fall again, and then you have to start all over again. When the Buddha saw that his listeners could acknowledge these drawbacks, then he'd teach them the Four Noble Truths. Those truths are counterintuitive in a lot of ways. But once he had prepared you to accept these truths, you'd be inclined to follow the duties with regard to them. Many times, as he would teach people these truths, they would have their first experience of awakening, called gaining the Dhamma eye. That was his gift to them. There were even people who went to see the Buddha to argue with him. There were even cases where people were sent to kill him, and yet this is how he responded. He talked to them in a way that made them open their eyes and gain awakening. A sign of the great compassion and the great goodwill that he had for all beings. So as I said earlier, think about the goodwill the Buddha had for you. What goodwill do you have for yourself? If you content yourself with anything less than awakening, you can't really say that you have goodwill, at least not in the Buddha's eyes, not in the framework provided by the Dhamma. So goodwill is a guardian in that it keeps you motivated to practice. Now, there are other passages in the canon that talk about how goodwill also protects you from the bad influences of past bad actions. If your goodwill is large and expansive, it lessens the impact of the bad things you did in the past. There's even a passage where he says that someone who is extending thoughts of goodwill is not going to die from fire or weapons. But the real protection is what genuine goodwill gets you to do now. It motivates you to keep on practicing because it forces you to think about what happiness is. It's pleasant enough to think, may all beings be happy, 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 but then you should start thinking more about, well, what would real happiness be? I knew of a woman one time who was having difficulties with her landlord, and she told me that she was trying to have goodwill for him. She was imagining him with a nice house, a swimming pool, lots of girlfriends, fancy cars. I said, wait a minute, no. You can have those things and still be miserable. Real goodwill has to do with may you be deeply happy at heart. That kind of happiness has to come from developing skillful qualities in the mind. Real happiness, of course, comes from seeing that what the Buddha taught is true. There is a deathless element, there is a dimension where the mind doesn't have to suffer from aging, illness, and death. When that becomes your standard for happiness, then goodwill really does protect you and guard you, because you won't be willing to settle for anything less than a happiness that's absolutely safe. Safe from heedlessness, safe from making you behave in unskillful ways. You develop the qualities that the Buddha said were key to his awakening. Persistence and an unwillingness to settle for second best. So thoughts of goodwill protect you not only from ill will, but also from laziness and complacency if you think those thoughts in the right way. This is where a generic good human quality becomes heightened as it's practiced in the context of the Dhamma. It's good for you to think of it in that context, too, and to act on it as well. That's when goodwill genuinely becomes a guardian meditation. Recollection of the Buddha. June 5, 2021. As the Buddha said, everywhere we go with craving as our companion. We think it's our friend, but it's a non-friend, as in the chant we chanted just now. It cheats us, it flatters and cajoles, it's good only in word, and it's our companion in ruinous fun. The question is, how much longer do we want to associate with that kind of friend? The Buddha offers himself as an alternative friend. An admirable friend, a person of conviction, generosity, virtue, and discernment. That's the kind of friend we want to develop outside, and the kind of friend we want to develop inside too, so that we can be our own best friend. As we sit here and meditate, we can make it a pleasant pastime doing it every now and then, or we can be more serious about it, realizing that it's not just a relaxation technique or a quiet way to spend an hour. It's a way to understand what's going on deep down inside the mind, and why the mind is so often fooled by its cravings. After all, we all want happiness, and yet cravings get us to do a lot of things that make us suffer. Why are we so bamboozled? What in us likes the craving? Why do we listen to it? Meditation allows you to find this out, but you have to stick with it. And to stick with it, you have to go against the craving. It'll tell you all kinds of reasons why you can delay the practice to some later time. One of its favorite arguments, of course, is the middle way. Don't put too much effort in. Don't push yourself too much. But as Ajahn Mahabua said, the middle way of craving is right in the middle of a pillow. And it just keeps taking us back to the same old places we've been to before, whereas, if we take the Buddha as our admirable friend, he's going to take us someplace new. But to take him as our friend requires dedication. It requires commitment, equanimity, patience, endurance. All those tough virtues. We have to find some way to generate desire inside, so that the tough virtues don't seem quite so tough and so forbidding. It's here that the guardian meditations are useful. This is a list of meditation topics that doesn't come in the canon. It comes someplace later. I don't know exactly where it originated. King Rama IV wrote a Pali poem based on the 4 guardian meditations in the 19th century, and that may be based on an earlier tradition. The topics are all found in the canon, though, and it's a useful set of topics to master. The first guardian meditation is recollection of the Buddha. You take seriously the fact that the Buddha is not just a mythic figure or an archetype. He was a real human being who decided that he wasn't going to be satisfied until he could find something deathless. What would it be like to meet somebody like that, or at the very least, to take that as an option, that this is what human beings can do? Human beings can be this dedicated, and they come out happy. Our society tends to think of people who take on a very serious religious vocation as warped or miserable. But here the Buddha is given the example of someone who was so dedicated that he was willing to torture himself to see if that was one of the options for finding true happiness. Fortunately, it was not. He found true happiness in another way. You can imagine how he would keep himself going. A lot of it had to do with how he talked to himself, how he kept the goal in mind, and with developing a great deal of truthfulness. He tried different paths and, as he said, he wouldn't rest satisfied until he knew that he had tried that path in a genuine way, so that he could say yes or no, that it really did or did not lead to the goal. So he offered himself up as an experimental subject. His body and his mind. They were the things that were going to be experimented on. And he had to feel his way. We have the advantage of having his example, so we should think about how fortunate we are to have that example, and what it says about us, that this is a potential that we have. We can be that true. We can be that dedicated. And happy. You say, I look at myself, and the Buddha's example seems to be very far away. But if you dedicate yourself to the next step and the next step and the next step in the path, you will find that you'll change as a person. The person you are right now is not the same person who's going to be finding awakening. You'll develop new qualities along the way. How do you develop them? Gradually. This is why the path is gradual. It takes a while to develop these qualities. That's why the path requires endurance as you stick with it. The Ajahns in Thailand found that Westerners coming to study with them tended to lack two qualities: endurance on one hand and equanimity on the other. But these are qualities in which we can train ourselves. I remember when I was there, some people would say, Westerners can do a good impersonation of a practitioner, but they don't have the stick-to-itiveness that's really needed. I took that as a challenge. So find whatever way you can to challenge yourself, and to see it as a challenge you're up for. The practice is not going to leave you strung out. After all, it is a middle way. It's just that your idea of the middle way, what's just right, is going to change as you practice. It's like exercising the body. The amount of exercise you do at the very beginning won't be adequate for the exercise regime as a whole, but as you work on it, whether it's in the number of miles you run, the weights you lift, or whatever, your idea of what's just right will grow as the exercise makes you stronger. Think about the Buddha. He started out as a prince, living a very luxurious and easeful lifestyle. Then he decided to go out and live in the wilderness, to live on alms. One version of his story, it's not in the canon, it's in one of the later versions, says that his reaction to his very first alms meal was disgust. He asked himself, am I going to have to live off this? But he stopped to reflect. This is food that's been offered freely, so he learned to look at the food in a positive way. Food that's offered freely comes with no strings attached. There's nothing unskillful in the way it's attained. So bit by bit, he was able to get his mind around a totally different style of living, until ultimately he was even able to torture himself. When, after 6 years, he realized that that was not the way, he was able to give up the pride that went along with that self-torture. Just think about it. What keeps a person going when you're giving things up? Usually there's a lot of pride. But when he realized that this was not the path, he was willing to swallow his pride and allow the 5 brethren to look down on him and to withdraw their respect. He didn't let that deter him. He was still looking for an alternative way. He kept at it to that extent. One of the lessons he learned was that you're not practicing to make yourself better than other people, or to exalt oneself or disparage others. As he said when he reflected on the 6 years of torture, he realized, when he compared himself to all the others in the past who had followed that route, that nobody else had ever gone this far. There was a comparing mind there. Which is why, in the customs of the noble ones, he says to be very careful about your practice of contentment. Make sure you're not disparaging other people or exalting yourself over the fact that you're more content than they are. So he learned from his own mistakes. That, too, should be part of our motivation. He was willing to recognize a mistake and learn from it. He didn't try to cover it up. So when we make our own mistakes, we shouldn't try to cover them up, either. He didn't let the fact that he'd spent 6 years in a blind alley deter him. As he said, there must be another way. That, too, is a good example. When you find yourself up against a brick wall, remind yourself there's got to be a way around it. Years back when I was in Thailand, I was translating Ajahn Mahabua, and I had just translated his talk on how the radiant mind is ignorance. Just at that point we had a monk from another tradition come to stay with us. We tended to have this pattern. Western monks from other monasteries came to our monastery usually when they were about to disrobe. This was their last straw. To try out one last place they had never been to before. This particular monk read the piece and got very disheartened. He said, "I've been trying to get to the radiant mind, thinking that that was the goal. Now I'm being told that even that is ignorance." Well, that attitude is the mindset that gets defeated, saying, "I've tried so hard, so hard, so hard and I'm still not there. I'm going to give up." That mindset is not one of your friends. The inner friend who has compassion for you, as the chant says, the one sympathetic to friends, is the one that reminds you, okay, what's past is past, but there's still energy. There's still the possibility of something new. So when you come to an impasse, remind yourself, there has to be a way around it. If there were no way around it, then the Buddha wouldn't have gained awakening. We already have his example. We have the example of the noble Sangha. There's got to be a way around it. It may take time, and this is where patience and endurance come in. Not that you just sit there and endure, but you watch. And you try to watch from a firm foundation, so that what you see is likely to be a lot more accurate. Think of the Buddha teaching Rahula to make his mind like earth. Not so that he would just sit there like a clod of dirt, but so that his mind would be solid, so that he could observe. When you do any scientific experiment, you want to make sure that the equipment is set on a solid table, and the solid table is based on a solid floor. Then the equipment can measure subtle things with a lot of precision and accuracy, and you can trust the results. In the same way, if you want to see subtle things in the mind, you've got to make your mind as solid as possible. That way, when the mind has its subtle movements, you can detect them. Otherwise, they're just there in the background. They seem to be part of the wake of your own movements. Or if everything seems to be unstable, you can't see anything at all. You're not sure which part is moving, which is staying still, because everything seems to be fluid and uncertain. So you've got to make your mind certain. That way, you'll have something that's certain to measure everything else by. This is one of the things we admire in the Buddha, probably the most solid person who ever lived. And as he kept saying, his qualities of ardency, resolution, and heedfulness were not his alone. As he put it, when he gained this or that level of jhana, this or that level of knowledge, it was as happens in one who is ardent, heedful, and resolute. In other words, anybody who develops these qualities is going to see these things, which opens the way for everybody. That should be the big message of trying to recollect the Buddha. That he showed what's possible, what potentials we have as human beings. Ajahn Lee made the comment one time that we human beings have lots of potentials within us, that we don't take advantage of potentials in the body in terms of the breath and the other elements, potentials in the mind in terms of the skills we can learn. We've got all these potentials, but what do we use them for? To make money, to gain fame, to get status, to get pleasures, things that just wash away. Whereas there's the example of the Buddha. It is possible to develop our potential so that we can find something deathless inside something outside space and time. That's a potential within us. When we think of the Buddha as our admirable friend, this is the lesson he gives. That we have a lot more potential than we think we do, and we shouldn't sell ourselves short. The part of the mind that takes this seriously is your friend, not the craving that wants to take things easy. Remember, the easy path is the one that leads to endless suffering. Whereas, the path that the Buddha laid out, even though it's hard at times, is not always hard. After all, a major part of the path, a central factor of the path, is right concentration, rapture, pleasure. And it leads to an end. A happiness that more than repays the effort put into the path. So when you think of the Buddha, make sure your thoughts then come back to your practice and have them energize your practice. That's the whole purpose of his teaching, which is to help us see that we have these potentials within us and that we can develop them. If you have any gratitude to the Buddha at all, which is the proper response, then you should want to develop those potentials as far as you can. A diffuse light. June 13, 2021. We have a book in our library with pictures of the peaks in California that are over 14,000 feet tall. It's a lovely book. At the back of the book is the photographer's note. He talks about how when he was younger, He used to travel the Sierras with a famous photographer who was known for his dramatic photos with sharp contrasts and intense colors. So when this photographer decided to set out and photograph all the peaks in California over 14,000 feet, he wanted the same effect. He took pictures right at dawn or right at sunset with the mountains picking up the colors of the rising or the setting sun, with intense oranges and pinks. But as he took rolls and rolls of film, he began to notice that he actually preferred the pictures he had taken before sunrise and after sunset, when the light was softened and diffuse. All the details of the peak stood out, each detail stood out and was given equal prominence. In the end, the photographs in that diffuse light were the ones he chose for the book. The book reminds me of a perception that's very useful in the meditation. We usually think of the breathing being done by certain parts of the body and not by other parts. Some of your muscles are the workers, and the others are the freeloaders. When we focus on the breath, we tend to focus on the workers and leave the freeloaders in the background. So we get an unbalanced picture of the breath in the body. In the beginning of the meditation, though, this picture is useful. You need a place to keep your focus anchored. And the conception of the breath goes to either. That's the one spot where you're inhaling, or that's the one spot that's doing the work of sucking in the air, sucking in a breath. Then, as the mind settles down, you can move from the perception of the breath coming from the outside to the perception of the breath originating inside. Here again, there are centers of the breath where the breathing sensations stand out. Ajahn Lee talks about them. The top of the head, the middle of the head, the palate, the base of the throat, the tip of the sternum, the point just above the navel. And those are just a few. You can think of the breath radiating from those spots. If you sense any spot where there's a blockage as that breath energy radiates from the centers, you allow the blockage to dissolve. This perception gets you closer to a state where you can breathe more and more calmly. You don't feel the need to pull breath energy in from outside because you realize it's already there inside. But you can move that perception even further. You can think of every cell in the body as being a little breath center, expanding and contracting. Every cell has the same weight, every cell pulls the same weight, and you try to expand your awareness to be in touch with all of those parts of the breath energy, without giving prominence to any one. As you do this, you begin to see a lot of details of the breath energy in the body that you would otherwise miss. At the same time, there's a very strong sense that there's never any moment when the body doesn't have breath. It's all there all the time. So you can stay with these breath sensations all the way through the in-breath, all the way through the out, and all the way in between. In this way, your focus doesn't have pauses. Often when we meditate, our attention is present in phrases, like phrases of music. A few notes are connected, and there's a pause. The next few notes are connected. Then there's a pause. Or like a movie where there are many different takes. There's a short take here, then the camera angle shifts, and there's a short take there. It's very rare that you have one long, single take where the camera doesn't move, and you don't leave that particular camera angle. But when you can stay with the one camera angle and have a long take, it's a lot calmer. You notice this with TV nowadays. The little bits and pieces of which the shows are compassed are a lot shorter. It's very frazzling for the nerves. One long take is much more calming. And here, your long take can be that every cell in the body is breathing in, breathing out. The in-breath shades into the out-breath, and the out-breath shades into the in-breath in all your cells. They're all right there all the time. It's as if the body were filled with a diffuse light, and all the details stand out. This is probably the best perception you can have to get the mind into strong states of concentration where the breath is minimal, and yet you don't feel starved of breath. You actually feel full. It may take a while to work up to this. You start out with a sense that you're going to spotlight some parts of the body rather than others, as you get going with the breath at the beginning of each meditation session. But there will come a time when you want to switch, first to the perception that the breath originates inside, and then to the perception that the breath originates with every cell equally throughout the body. See what that does to help the mind settle down. Your calming mental fabrication. In other words, the perception of the breath originating in every cell is much calmer than the perception of the breath originating in any one spot to the detriment of others. And both are calmer than the perception that the breath has to come from outside. As the perceptions get the mind calmer, they get the breath calmer as well. This is one of the ways in which the Buddha's 4 tetras in breath meditation are all happening at the same time. You're calming bodily fabrication by calming mental fabrication. It's in this way that you can begin to see how all 4 tetras, the tetrad related to the body, the tetrad related to feelings, the tetrad related to the mind, and the tetrad related to dhammas help one another along. As you get more sensitive to the process of fabrication, energize it in the beginning, and then calm it down. You're following the same pattern of the factors for awakening. You energize with analysis, which builds on mindfulness, followed by effort and rapture. Then you calm things down with calm, concentration, and equanimity. It's that active analysis of qualities that helps you see fabrication, while the more passive ones help you to calm fabrication down. You see the body and the mind working together in this way for the sake of a very stable, solid awareness. That allows you to pick up insights in areas that used to be hidden by the fact that the spotlight was someplace else. After all, wherever there's a spotlight, there's going to be a lot of darkness around it. But where there's a diffuse light, everything is allowed to glow with its own inner light. Everything can show itself for what it is. In alignment with the teachings of the Buddha, we emphasize the profound importance of sharing wisdom far and wide. We've made this extensive 1,000-page work accessible in audio format, and the responsibility to further this noble cause now rests with you. Through your subscriptions, likes, and the sharing of our content, you play a central role in the widespread dissemination of these teachings, which can benefit numerous others. Let's continue the timeless tradition of spreading knowledge and nurturing mindfulness for the betterment of humanity. We wholeheartedly invite you to join us in this endeavor, and together, we can make a profound and positive impact on the lives of many.